Welcome to Charles Dickens, A Brain on Fire, a series that digs deep into the life and works of one of the greatest novelists of all time. Hello everyone. Today's guest is the Lord Northcliffe Professor of Modern English Literature at University College London. He is a broadcaster, a journalist. He has a specialism in 18th and 19th century literature. He is also steeped in contemporary writing and was famously one of the judges that awarded Hilary Mantel the Booker Prize for her Wolf Hall. He also wrote the celebrated book What Matters in Jane Austen, a writer he describes as a goddess. His latest book is The Artful Dickens, which I'm holding in my hand, and is now available in paperback. I am, of course, speaking about the brilliant Professor John Mullen, who joins us now to talk about his favourite Dickens novel, Great Expectations. John, hello, welcome.
Hi, good to be with you.
We're here for a special reason to talk about Great Expectations, and I've picked up over the last year or so since you published The Artful Dickens and you've been doing interviews, that Great Expectations is your favourite. And I wondered, first of all, if you could tell us a little bit about why it's your favourite.
Yeah, I remember once a student I was teaching who'd read quite a lot of Dickens, actually, much more than students usually have read, said, "Oh, I agree, Great Expectations is my favourite for the obvious reason." And I said, "What's that?" And she said, "Well, it's the only one without a happy ending." And there's an insight in that, I think, which is that there is something extraordinary about the way in which, even in the revised ending that Great Expectations provided, which maybe we can talk about a bit later, Dickens didn't quite gratify his usual Victorian inclination to sort of reward and punish at the end of the novel in the ways that sort of represented poetic justice. And that's because of something quite deep about the novel, which is that, of course, it's a first-person narration, but it's shot through with a sense of kind of self-blame and self-criticism, some of which perhaps is borrowed from its autobiographical aspect and which belongs to the author himself, and which is really sort of unique in Dickens, I think, in his fiction. But that's a rather waffly way of saying why it's my favorite. Another way of saying it would be to say that I just think it's sort of formally the most perfect of his novels. And so although I love the Dickens that is copious and wasteful and that can't resist giving you a picture of a character who's not needed for the story, but there he is in a shop on the Pentonville Road, so Dickens has got to give him to you in all his peculiarity. That Dickens isn't really part of Great Expectations. It's the most tightly, minutely organized and perfected novel, and seems to me to be the one which, where he's absolutely at the peak of his powers. So that's another reason why I like it so much.
Yes, no, I think that rings very true to me. And one of the reasons I like it so much is that, one, its emotional impact. I find myself really floored by it emotionally, but also the fact that through Pip, Dickens isn't trying to impress us. I think what you were saying about that compulsion to have these fancy characters and these little set pieces, it isn't quite there. And he writes in very, very direct sentences, doesn't he? And the fact that Pip doesn't want to impress us, quite the opposite. He's really confiding in us all the time, all the darkest thoughts and feelings he has.
Yes, he is. And when he does that, I mean, it's interesting you should say confiding in us, because if we think about one or two other Victorian novels which are famous for confiding in us, Jane Eyre, that's a very good example, but a wonderful novel Dickens loved. But quite a useful comparison, because if you read, there's something very peculiar about Great Expectations compared to Jane Eyre, and that is that when Pip confides in us, he will often confide in us about something that hasn't yet happened, And so, as you probably know, I mean, there's my book, The Artful Dickens, is about Dickens's sort of tricks and adventurous innovations in storytelling, and one of them is the way he breaks the rule, brilliantly breaks the rule about not telling you about things that haven't happened yet. So in a usual first-person novel like Jane Eyre or many others, the convention is that the narrator will not show that he or she knows about something, which they do know about, which hasn't happened yet, because obviously the narrator is looking back years later. But Dickens breaks that rule. So when Pip confides in us, he will say something like, there's an example when he's talking about Biddy and his relationship with Biddy when they're both just age 14 or 15. And he says, she said with a strangely sorrowful air, something like that. And he says, which I didn't understand then, though I do now.
Yes.
And so the representation of his relationship with Biddy is shot through with his understanding, which he shares with you implicitly, that years later he realized that she loved him.
Yeah.
But at the time he was too stupid and too conceited and too self-important to know that, even though it was implicit in everything she said. And he shares that rueful knowledge that comes too late to him, sort of with the reader. And that can, and Great Expectations is all about knowledge that comes too late, things you realize that you should have realized before, something which I think is part of his extraordinary appeal on to all intelligent readers, because we all have that, don't we? Oh my God, I know now, but I should have known then.
Yes.
That's what it's all about.
Him breaking that convention of that, what you call the foreseeing, I think, in your chapter in The Artful Dickens, him sort of breaking that makes it more kind of personable, I think, somehow. More that he's in the room with you almost, and that he's
like that person who's telling a story and can't help but say, and this would turn out badly. But anyway, I'll come to that.
Yes.
And often that's an inept way of telling a story, isn't it? You know, that you can't, the person who can't resist throwing in something which comes later in the story. But of course it can be a really clever device. Literary critics call it prolepsis. But that's sort of telling you something too early, foreseeing something that's going to happen. And I mean, lots of sort of clever postmodern novelists sort of use it. The great person who used it, it's a slight digression, but the person who used it and called it flash forwards was Muriel Spark. So she will, I'm a great admirer of her novels, she will tell you in her novel, in brackets sometimes, something that happens years later to the character. Flash forwards, but Dickens sort of developed this. No, he does it in David Copperfield as well. He does it in Dombey and Son. It's not the only novel where he does it, but I think especially powerful in Great Expectations because it's a novel of regret and ruefulness and self-condemnation. I mean, there have been readers down the years who have thought sort of Pip's too hard on himself almost.
Yes, I sort of think that in certain points, but I think you feel that way because he's so open and honest and never seems to want to sort of put himself in a good light before you.
Yes, that's incredible. I mean, that's true. There's some of that in almost every chapter. But I was thinking about that chapter, which I think you probably are interested in too. The almost painfully unreadable chapter where Joe Gargery visits. I know. It's brilliant though, isn't it? Joe Gargery visits Pip in London when Pip has become a gentleman and he's spent, silly sums of money on sort of, wearing a silly dressing gown and getting sort of a sofa and, upholstering curtains in his apartment in Barnard's Inn, which actually really, the place itself is quite grim, but he's sort of tarted it up. And Joe Gargery is sent with a message for him, a summons from Miss Havisham. And Joe, who's in fact his brother-in-law, but is about 20 years older than him, and who is the person who's most loved him in his whole life and still does, but is illiterate and is a mere blacksmith. There's this encounter where Pip looks back on himself behaving in this sort of, he's not horrible, but he's conceited. And there's this agonizing thing, isn't it, that Joe slips in and out of different ways of speaking to him. He's quite a sort of inarticulate person. And he'll sort of, one moment he's talking to him as Pip, and the next moment he's calling him Sir. And he's physically incredibly awkward, and he's putting on his best clothes and a stick up under his chin. And I mean, it's like all the best bits of Great Expectations. It's both comic and something else. Sometimes Great Expectations is comic and frightening, but here it's sort of comic and painful, isn't it?
Yes, but I'm amazed that you say the comedy, how Dickens weaves that in, because your heart bleeds for Joe in that sequence.
Yes.
And yet it still has all this detail about him trying to prop his hat up on the chimney piece and it falling and him dropping food on the floor. But I don't know any other writer that seems to be able to do that, because isn't that breaking the rules? If you're trying to convey something across the reader, the sympathy for this character, that you have so much kind of silliness around it as well.
Yes. I mean, I think Dickens is the master of in some ways make you laugh when you shouldn't laugh. And of course, I mean, that's not unknown in comedy. And there are quite a lot of, comedians down the years, including on stage and on television, who go to that sort of tricky area. Sometimes they get it wrong, where you're laughing because you shouldn't be laughing, as it were. But I mean, Dickens is absolutely, that's his thing. And of course, sometimes there is blithe and painless laughter from his novels. But I think in Great Expectations, think of the first chapter.
Yes.
You read back everybody remembers the first chapter, the graveyard scene, and perhaps partly because of the film and TV adaptations of it. People remember it as this scene of childhood terror, which it is. But actually, if you read it, it's also quite funny, because when he thinks back on Magwitch slightly as a, he has these sort of Stephen King-like fantasies that Magwitch is a dead pirate who's come back to life from the gibbet across the marshes. And having done his scary bit with Pip, he's now stalking back across the marshes to the gibbet as if he were going to hang himself back up again.
Yes, yes, and then on top of that, in that moment, he sees the cows turning their heads towards Magwitch as he approaches, wondering if they thought the same thing too.
Yes,
which again,
absolutely, and that is perfect Great Expectations, isn't it? Because Pip he's sensitive, but in that sense, we sometimes use it of people in a slightly satirical sense. Better not joke. He's a bit sensitive. He's always thinking he's been got at. Yeah. So even the cows are getting at him. Even the cows, as it were, are sort of laughing at him, perhaps, maybe.
Yes.
And you'll know that bit because I quote it in my book, but I mean that sums it up. That we're talking about his sort of fantasies, his recollection of his childhood fantasies, as if the cows are thinking this too. And Great Expectations is full of as if, these flights of fantasy, which are flights of fancy, which are there throughout Dickens, but are particularly thick in Great Expectations. And one of my favorite ones is that one where he says about Mr. Jaggers, the bullying lawyer, who is the person who comes to him when he's still an apprentice blacksmith and says, you've been left a load of money, you can come up to London and be a gentleman. And Mr. Jaggers, who's this threatening person, really, and it says, Mr. Jaggers never smiled, never laughed. He never laughed, but he had great, bright, creaking boots. And sometimes he poises himself on these boots. I can't remember, the wording is so brilliant, I won't get it quite right, but he poisons himself and causes them to creak as if they laughed in a dry and suspicious manner. And on the one hand, you can hear the noise of the boots, can't you?
Yes.
And on the other hand, it's complete paranoid fantasy. This guy's making his boots laugh at you. But that's what Pip's like, isn't he? He fears that he's being got at, he's being laughed at.
Yes, it's a very much a childhood thing as well, isn't it? I mean, I think he's able to perceive, Dickens is able to write so feelingly as a child in a way that we can all understand. And I think I actually feel like Pip treats the reader as an equal, because he talks about that. You quoted in your book again, that was a memorable day for me, where he talks about the chains of events in our own lives. And he says, pause, you who read this.
Yes.
Which is a wonderful moment. And I remember, one of the reasons I love Great Expectations so much is I remember being 17 when I read it. At that point in your life where you're making these sorts of choices each day about which way your life is going to go. And I remember being so struck by that and feeling like that end of that chapter just cut right across time.
Yeah, no, I mean, that if you access certain moments from childhood, they're completely undimmed by time, you know. But also, as you're suggesting, I think, when you read it, we all remember, and the laser goes back into the past, just straight through the clouds of the years to that moment. And that moment in the first chapter, and you can absolutely see that has to be the first chapter of Great Expectations. There can't be anything before that. That moment of that encounter with the convict, Magwitch, of course, we don't know for a long time what he's called, is the moment out of which everything comes. And so even, you know, there's an amazing description quite late in the novel where Pip is in the boat taking Magwitch down the Thames. And it's the moment, actually, I chose to end my own book because it's such a wonderful piece of writing. And it's a wonderful piece of writing, again, breaking almost all the rules that you're taught in primary school about how to write. You know, don't use lots of ands, don't repeat yourself, don't use cliches. You know, Dickens, he does all those things. Whoa. And Pip in narration goes into a sort of reverie, sort of dream, because as they're going down the Thames, they're trying to intercept the packet boat that goes to Hamburg and smuggle Magwitch onto it so he can escape from Britain. And they can't put him on the boat in London because they think the wharves are being watched. And they're out in the Thames estuary, somewhere out, you know, beyond Tilbury, God knows. And there's hardly anybody out there. And there's marshes and mud. And Pip realizes that this is like his own marsh country. This is like the place we started. And he goes back into a sort of childlike reverie, actually. And, you know, it's no wonder the Freudian literary critics have had lovely time with Great Expectations, because it's a novel about, he's got expectations. He always got ambitions. He thinks he's going forward, but no, he's always going back. He's always being taken back to his childhood, to the past, which he thought he was going to, you know, he thought he was this guy who was going to kind of become a gentleman, escape from the marshes and the blacksmith's forge and the sort of grubbiness of his own origins. But in fact, no, you're always going back.
Yeah. I don't know if I've really read this somewhere, but there's a sense that Dickens doesn't do psychological depth or truth in his characters, but I just don't understand where that comes from, really. You read a book like this, I mean, a character like Biddy, how do you have Biddy if you don't have subtext?
Yes, exactly. Well, you're right. Subtext, it is, isn't it? Because the whole representation of Biddy through Pip relies on you as a reader being able to infer or guess at what must really be going on in her head. And you're helped to do that by Pip's own hints that we were talking about earlier, his own sort of, oh, if only I'd realized, or I would understand this better later, which are, you know, just quite useful little nudges to the reader, apart from anything else, to kind of do some thinking here. And so you're never told. So nothing in the novel ever says Biddy loved Pip. You know, not loved him in a sisterly way, loved him as in she wanted to spend her life with him way, loved him amorously, loved him for the best side of him, which she could see, even though he kept showing the worst side of himself to her. But nothing says that, does it? But you as a reader have such a distinct sense of it, built from her words, as you would like a character in a play who's saying things, and the things they're saying are not what they think, but they are clues to what they think. Yeah. And that's that brilliant. I mean, it is also painful, but it's kind of, again, funny when Pip, after all the disasters of his life, and Magwitch has died, and Compeyson has been killed, and Pip's money's all gone, and Estella is lost forever and has gone and married Bentley Drummle, and Pip, you know, is at the end of it all. And then he does that thing, which I think is partly comic, because I think it's the kind of thing men do, actually. They go, oh, I haven't got a girlfriend. Oh, what about X? She quite like me. They never go and find someone new. They kind of they look up in the address book they've already got. Oh, she quite like me. And he thinks, Biddy liked me. And actually, come to think of it, I'm pretty keen on Biddy. And she's pretty presentable, and we could have a perfect, okay. And he goes down to Kent to sort of claim her, doesn't he? And he arrives, and he can't understand it. Her school is closed, and it's not a Sunday. I mean, he goes along back to where he lived, and the forge is closed. And then the best parlour is in the house, which is never used, is being used. And there's sort of nice fresh curtains and flowers. And there's Biddy looking really smart. And Joe's looking quite smart. And she says, oh, we're so glad that you've come. It is my wedding day. I married Joe.
I know. I'm reading it. Your heart skips a beat, because you know that he's one sentence away from admitting why he's arrived, and he's just saved by them saying that they're married before he proposes to them.
Yes. Oh. I think it's even better than that, isn't it? Because he says to the reader, of course, he's just before he comes down, he's been really, really ill for a long time, and Joe has looked after him. Yeah, and to some extent, their old bond has returned. But then, as Pip gets well again, Joe starts calling him Sir again, because he's returning to his gentlemanly status, and they're together in Pip's rooms, and Pip's kind of back in his right senses, and he thinks, right, tomorrow morning I'm going to tell Joe that I do everything that's been on my mind, and how I know what an awful person I've been, and one of the things he's going to tell him is that he's decided that sort of he loves Biddy, and you know he'll but Joe, he gets up in the morning and Joe is gone, and has just left him a sort of semi-literate note and the receipt for the debts that Joe has paid off out of his savings. And in that later chapter, when Joe and Biddy have just been married, Pip says, doesn't he, thank goodness that I didn't get the chance to tell him as I was about to. I was on the brink of it, about me and Biddy. And he says something about, if I'd said that could never have been undone.
Yeah.
You know, that could never have been undone. And so the whole possibility of any happiness for Joe and Biddy would have been gone.
Yeah.
It would have been gone. But he luckily never said it.
Yeah, it's one of the most fraught moments reading it, I found just the other day. But something else though, poor Biddy, is that Pip, right from his smallest years, he's quite prepared to take everything he needs from her, isn't he? You know, that thing about the best step I could take towards making myself uncommon was to get out of Biddy everything she knew. You know, and it's just full, and she agrees to it immediately. And it's, I mean, she's such a wonderful, selfless character, isn't she?
She is selfless, but she's, you know, I think she's quite intelligently selfless. She's not one of those. She's not one of those Dickensian saintly women, I don't think. And again, one reason, a negative reason why people often love Great Expectations the most is that it doesn't have saintly women in. It has at least one demonic woman in, and perhaps two. But even Biddy's not saintly. So in her exchanges with Pip, she does sort of present him with truths that he chooses not to see the point of, that he ignores. And also, if you look at what she says, I think the dialogue, I was looking at again, the chapter where, Pip tells Biddy that really he thinks he's cut out for better things than being a blacksmith's apprentice, and really can't Joe improve himself a bit, and as the idiom has it, there's no telling people. In some ways, I think arguably she reacts not in a saintly fashion, but quite a realistic fashion to Pip. So she doesn't sort of argue with him, but she gives him every chance to hear the truth, and he just chooses not to.
Yes. He even holds it to be true, doesn't he, in moments, and then just drops it and says, despite my better judgment or whatever. But what's interesting is that the way that sequence is set up, where they go off for the walk together and Joe is looking after Mrs. Joe.
Yeah.
So it's set up a bit like a proposal scene, almost, that you expect it to go one way, and they're sat and they're looking out to the ships and everything, and it goes, one of the most unromantic line he says is, "If I could only get myself to fall in love with you, Biddy, everything would be fine." You think the most insulting, insensitive.
That's brilliant, isn't it? Although, of course, and of course, I think you probably know that amongst the very few notes that Dickens left for when he was composing Great Expectations, unlike most of his novels, then there aren't lots and lots of plans and notes for it. Amongst the very few notes he left is a thing about what ages the characters were at certain stages. And it's quite important to the exchange we're just talking about, that Pip, I think, is about 14 or something, and Biddy's about 15. So it has this added thing that they're not actually really old enough yet to be talking about getting married. Although in Victorian England, they're only a couple of years off it, probably.
Yes.
But they're not yet old enough. So when he says that great line, which you just quoted, it is, what a sort of numbskull thing to say. But also, it's still the sort of thing a 14-year-old might say.
Yeah.
I'm going to plan, because he's full of sort of grand schemes about himself. So things about falling in love and marriage are still sort of part of some future game plan, as it were.
Yes, and it's written very well as that sort of adolescent on the cusp, because that description of him tearing handfuls of grass and throwing them is very sort of childish, and at the same time he's talking about future prospects and about his
so at this stage, even the fact that Biddy's a year older than him is probably sort of matters a bit, because she sort of understands this stuff a bit better than him, one suspects.
Yes. And I suppose with Estella as well, because they're the three of them are all around the same age, aren't they?
Yes, Estella's
And but that description of when he meets Estella for the first time about how she behaved like she was 1 and 20 and a queen.
Yes.
I think it's sort of excellent. The idea about, which we can relate to when you're a teenage boy, that girls develop quicker than you, don't they? They do seem much more mature and more like a young woman when you're still sort of nudging younger childhood.
Yeah, and of course it's what Pip perceives as the kind of class difference between them, which is the sort of and he feels every pinch of condescension, and she knows that and exploits that. Of course, it turns out that she is the daughter. Her father's a convict. Spoiler alert. And her mother is a murderess.
I know. That's such an interesting idea in the book, isn't it? That people take decisions to protect the people above them in society in the way that Joe really supports Pip's desire to be a gentleman and will do everything to make that a reality for him, calling him sir and nursing him, paying off debts, all of these things. And it's the same with Estella, isn't it? When that information is out there and Pip knows, is it Jaggers he talks to, and he's dissuaded from Estella ever being told about the truth.
Yeah. I mean, the whole novel is set up to, in a way, we know it's set up to disappoint or radically undermine Pip's expectations, but also everybody else's. Actually, there's a great bit at the end of the first volume of Great Expectations. It says something like, "Here ends the first stage of Pip's expectations." And so, Pip's expectations aren't just things in his head. It's actually the structure of the novel is about expectations. So it's a novel about somebody who thinks that their story is one thing, and it turns out to be something completely different. And that completely different story involves lots of other people's as well. Estella, far from being this sort of lofty beauty, is somebody who's come to their station in life through a really dark story. So even Pip's visions of what other people's narratives are like is all completely wrong.
Yeah. And it's a fantastic irony, isn't it, that I'm sure Estella in London society beggars all these people in high society, despite her background. That's a huge irony, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
I think there is a character I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, John, and that's Mrs. Jo Gargery. Because when I read that at 17, I thought, God, what a horrible woman she is. God, don't like her. And that was it, Reading it later again, I sort of have quite a lot of sympathy for her, oddly, and I wonder if you do too. I think there are just obviously what happens to her is terrible, but just that there's something about, going back to the psychology.
Sympathy. Where does that come from?
I tell you what, that's a very, very valid question. I may not even persuade you, but I think in the fourth chapter when it's the Christmas dinner, and Pip makes up the lie about where he's been, and he says, I was by the church listening to the carols, and she says that thing about, I'm rather partial to carols myself, and that's the best of reasons for never my hearing any. It's that thing of she believes herself to be a slave with her apron never off. And and it's Jo, I think, isn't it, that persuades her to take in her brother and raise him as a son.
Yes. You feel, well, I'm not sure. I sort of feel that if Mrs. Jo had wanted to go to the carols, she would have gone to the carols. Because just before that, it said, doesn't it say, about going to church on Christmas Day, something about Mrs. Jo went to church vicariously. That is to say, Jo and I went.
Yeah.
Jo is absolutely under her heel, isn't he? And actually, the one thing that later on Jo himself wants some kind of absolution for from Pip is that he sometimes didn't manage to stop Mrs. Jo beating Pip.
Yeah.
And Jo says, and the reason is that I did try sometimes, but sometimes the more I tried, the more she would beat you. So actually, it was counterproductive. It brought more cruelty upon you. I mean, those are my highfalutin words. He doesn't say it like that. I sort of think that her self-depiction there as a kind of galley slave to Jo and Pip is pretty unconvincing. Really.
Yes, I think she's very much a narcissist, isn't she, in her perception and how she treats her.
I think the thing is that here's the place where we've got a Dickens novel and we can't turn it into a George Eliot novel sort of thing. I mean, if it was a George Eliot novel and Mrs. Jo was to be, as she is in Dickens's novel, quite an important character, at least especially in the first volume of the novel, then we would get her sort of inner life. We would get her angle on things. And we would get some sense, I think, that of that sort of George Eliot-ish thing, that to know all is to forgive all, and that somebody who looks like a monster from one point of view shift and have a look at the world from their point of view, and suddenly you can see the reasons, not to exonerate them, but you can see the reasons why they are as they are. This novel doesn't do that, and it's not interested in doing that. It's from Pip's point of view. You know, Dickens is a novelist of the external sometimes, but I don't think it's any sort of somehow less realistic than a different way of doing character. It's true to the fact that quite a lot of people that we come across, we will only ever see from the externals. And therefore, in a way, it's a bit beside the point to say, oh, well, mate, perhaps Mrs. Joe has had quite a hard time. She's the only surviving person apart from Pip, you know, and you can imagine a whole sort of fantasy plot. Well, she was the only girl amongst all these boys. They all died. You know, perhaps it was terribly difficult for her. Who knows? Who knows? But she is this person with tickler. Yeah. And she is this person beating the tattoo on his head with her thimble. And she is this person on the rampage, as Joe says, we're using a phrase which had never been used in English before, apparently, on the rampage. Yeah.
Wow. Well, that's excellent. But I think what I find interesting is certainly Pip doesn't seem to be able to forgive her, because when she eventually suffers the attack from Orlick, I always think that section reads a bit like very forensically. And there's that bit which says, you know, she had been struck with something blunt and heavy on the head and spine. After the blows were dealt, something heavy had been thrown down on her with considerable violence as she lay on her face. And then he goes on to say, she had been felled before she could look round. However, her temper was greatly improved and she was patient. And, you know, I mean, that can...
but isn't that's sort of truthful, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, Pip can't suddenly convert his feelings for her into kindness and solicitude, can he? And it's got that twist of truthfulness about how in her sort of whatever state, it's not quite, I mean, she is conscious, isn't she? She can hardly speak. She can more or less not speak. But she's aware of what's going on around her. And in this sort of state, and she can only sit in a chair or lie in a bed, she becomes patient in a way that she never was before, and she becomes better natured in a way that she wasn't before. And I mean, that's quite sort of funny. Yeah. In a dark way, that is quite funny, I think, and believable. And then she also has this thing, which is a real Dickensian twist, that she makes this sign, which looks like a T. And she makes this, she can't say, but she can make this sign like a T. And then it's Biddy who works out that it's not a T, it's a hammer. And then the hammer means, and it's Biddy who also works it out, but it's actually Orlick who does the hammering of the iron in the smithy that she wants to see. And of course, at this stage, we don't know that it's Orlick who actually did this damage to her with the leg iron as a weapon. So it's her sort of, she actually finds his presence reassuring, even though it was him who did her in. And she is his sort of, not just his victim, but also, well, she's sort of doubly his victim because he has a weird sort of power over her. And that's a really strange twist of psychology, but one I find gruesomely believable, actually.
Yeah, I do. And is trying to understand whether or not she's frightened of him and trying to placate him by
Yes,
inviting him in to have a
yes.
drink and all of that, or whether she's genuinely trying to show forgiveness and it's never really answered, is it?
I
It's never.
don't think it's the latter. I don't think it can be the latter.
Okay.
Um, because also Orlick is completely immune to that sort of thing. Orlick is sort of Pip's sort of nasty twin, isn't he? But Orlick's just interested in power and who has power over whom, and um, and his great fuel of his whole existence, which is only ever implicit until the amazing scene out in the lime kiln when he's going to kill Pip, is resentment. Resentment is his fuel. And of course, brilliantly in the novel, again, a sign of its psychological complexity, even if some of the characters seem observed only on the surface, is it's got this psychological thing that Orlick's murderous rage, and sadistically murderous rage when he thinks he's about to kill Pip, is born of the same kind of inclination that Pip himself had. I'm sick of being down there, of thinking other people are above me, looking down on me, actually. And he's got also, Orlick, a kind of really disturbing interest in Biddy, hasn't he?
Yeah, because that's the other part that's awful for Biddy in that chapter with them where they talk, and he says, "Oh, if only I could love you, Biddy." And they're walking back, and who's there but Orlick? And she's looking over her shoulder the whole time, saying, "I don't like him," and he dances at me, and then Pip, in a way that's very blokish, isn't it? Pip gets very territorial almost towards her, and suddenly he's outraged that Orlick shows interest
Yes,
in her
yes,
after essentially rejecting her a few moments before.
Yes, yeah, and it's another example of, in one of the chapters in my book is about how sort of Dickens does or doesn't do sex in his novels. And there is lots of evasion and euphemism and so on in places in Dickens. But when he's at his best, he manages to, I think, to use rather than just to submit to the codes of suppression, and not being explicit that he felt were overwhelming at the time. So that, for instance, in the example we've just talked about, Biddy can't say what it is about Orlick that she doesn't like, but we know, don't we? We know what it is. His interest in her is predatory and sexual. We know that. And, she doesn't even like being alone near him. And we know exactly why that is, but it's totally implicit, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And in some ways, more the more affecting, isn't it? Because of what's unsaid, I think.
Yes.
And a striking moment, because you've mentioned him, is Jaggers and talking about Estella and the servant, Molly, being her mother. There's this one moment that I find strikingly modern as well, which when he, I think you mentioned this in your book as well, where he claps his hand around her wrist like a trap, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, that exchange there is like Harold Pinter, isn't it?
Yes, it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. And again, it's extraordinary in terms of what we're expected to infer about sex, because Molly, of course, once she was this fiery and attractive young woman, and Jaggers specializes in people who are accused of quite serious capital offences, and sometimes he gets them off. And we find, in retrospect, in the course of the novel, the backstory of how Jaggers managed to get the young Molly off the charge of murder. And the implication is she did murder this woman, who was a rival for Magwitch's attentions. And she was Molly was Magwitch's girlfriend and Estella's mother. And of course, she had to give up the child. And, if it was a 21st century novel, it would be all her story. We glimpse this kind of hidden tragedy. And, the implication is Jaggers got her off, and she is therefore his servant. She owes him. He's got her. And he gets her off on quite spurious argument. And it's all about scratches. How did she get all these scratches, which are actually from her victim? oh, because she went through a hedge, and he manages to make up a brilliant story about it. Now she is a servant, sort of 15, 18 years later, and he does this thing of suddenly grabbing her hand. And the way he treats her is really interesting. And the way he speaks to her, oh, Molly, 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 Molly. The only time in Dickens somebody says somebody's name 4 times, Molly, 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 Molly. He's at once totally powerful, but also weirdly intimate with her. And he grabs her wrist, as he says, and he says, look at those hands, look at the power in them. And her arms are scarred still. And I think the implication is very, very clearly that, you know, theirs is a ménage, that she's his sexual partner. Certainly has been, probably still is. He's this man who lives, she's the only other person in the house. He's got plenty of money, but he has this one servant who's Molly. He is intimate with her. And Dickens lets us see that in order, I think, partly in order to imagine what, after all, social historians will tell you was often the case, that people had sex with their servants, you know, that men especially had sex with their female servants in relationships which were often, if not abusive, at least kind of, exploitative. Highly exploitative. Well, Dickens isn't going to give you that directly, but he lets you infer it, I think. I don't think, when I first read Great Expectations, I don't think I got that, but it seems really, really clear now.
Yes, I didn't the first time either, but I think I agree. Absolutely. I can see that. And I'm interested to know, this is sort of almost like a beginning question, really, but what was it that drew you to Great Expectations? When did you first read it? How many times have you read it over the years?
Well, I think that I first read it as a sort of, when I was about 18 or something, perhaps slightly out of a sense of duty. Maybe I wanted an extra thing to put on my personal statement on whatever UCAS forms were called in those days, you know, something to talk about at university interview, although I didn't. What I do remember is whenever I first read it, I do remember this sense that I wasn't quite sure if Dickens was proper literature, or still wasn't quite sure. So I knew that sort of Conrad and Henry James were proper literature. And I think I knew that George Eliot and Jane Austen were proper literature, although I still hadn't quite clocked on to why Jane Austen was good. But I could see she wrote proper, you know, really elegant, beautifully written sentences. And of course, Dickens writes fantastic sentences, but they're stranger and less conventional and often less elegant. And I think that it took me a long time to realize how good Great Expectations was, but also actually simply how incredible Dickens was. And that this thing of him being sort of an entertainer, I think, misshaped my attitude to him for a long, long time. And it was only really, funnily enough, I think I came out of this partly by getting into quite a lot of contemporary fiction, which I was writing about in newspapers and things. And then I wrote us a book which was partly about the tricks that contemporary literary novelists use. And time again, I sort of thought, hang on, I think maybe Dickens did this first, you know? and then I suppose I came rather belatedly and in a rather literary critical way to realize that some of my sort of initial assumptions were totally, totally wrong. But Great Expectations, I've read it long. In answer to the factual question, I've read it. How many times have I read it? I think I've read Dickens' Great Expectations probably 7 or 8 times. But I can thank the fact that it has for a long time been a set book for our undergraduates taking our Victorian literature module, on which I teach. And it's very salutary, Dominic, when you have to teach 20-year-olds who've sometimes read a book for the very first time and finished it the night before. Now, they may not know that much about it, but their synapses are really firing. And if you are relying on what you remember from having read it 4 years earlier or 5 years earlier, you can get into real trouble because they've all got it right there. I had to reread it quite often as a duty, and it became a huge pleasure.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. I mean, I think I can understand what you were saying earlier about being critical of him and not sure where he sits. It's a very youthful thing to think, isn't it? Where does this person sit against that person? But I remember I went through a spell of stopping reading Dickens. I started for the first time in my late teens, but then I didn't go to university, but I spoke to people that had been to Oxbridge, and they were talking about how his prose is too full and all these things, and it's put doubts in my mind. And so I moved away thinking that it wasn't, like you said, the great literature it was. And then you come back and you think, do they have any idea who they're dealing with here? Yes. It's extraordinary, yes. Isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that that still goes on. And it started in Dickens's own day, actually. So even in his own day, even if you read reviews of his work, which are quite sort of admiring, they will often still be a bit condescending. After all, he sold so many books, it can't be great literature, can it? But there are exceptions. I mean, I went to a few years ago. I went on a British Council Beano to Russia to talk about fiction with some British writers, and we went to Tolstoy's house, his estate at Yasnaya Polyana. It's about 150 miles south of Moscow, and we were shown Tolstoy's study, and he moved it around this big house. And as he got older, he moved it closer and closer to his bedroom because he became more and more infirm. And there it was right next to his bedroom. And there was his desk. And in Russia, literary shrines are not like British shrines. They're not facsimiles. They're the real thing. All the pictures, all the furniture is as it was. And amazing, above his desk on the wall is a large portrait, which apparently he had for most of his working life above his desk, of Dickens. So every time he was trying to rack his brains writing War and Peace or The Death of Ivan Ilyich or something, he'd look up and there, the master, Dickens. But I don't think that he was taken seriously in that Tolstoyan way by most of his contemporaries. And there's a long history of him being regarded as a mere entertainer amongst critics and readers. And I think that has changed, but not completely. One of the things that I tried to do a bit when I wrote about him was kind of, I paid a lot of attention to his plans, his manuscripts, how he wrote. And he clearly in some ways wrote in a remarkably improvisatory way. He had to, because he was writing for serialization. He was having to write installments and publish them before he'd finished the novel. But on the other hand, he was the most attentive and minutely scrupulous, formal sort of craftsman, to use a hackneyed metaphor, and just did things formally with novels that people had never done before, and sometimes so extraordinary that people at the time didn't even seem to notice or comment on it. It's an extraordinary fact that I know we're talking about Great Expectations, which I think is a formally brilliant novel, but to take an example, Bleak House, an earlier novel, is written in chapters which alternate between present tense chapters and past tense chapters. The ones in the present tense are narrated in the third person. The ones in the past tense are narrated in the first person. I mean, nobody'd ever done anything like this before. And not a single review of the time, and there are many, many reviews, comments on the fact. It's as if it's so weird and unusual, but it's almost invisible to critics. And I think he was, I think like many people, when I started off reading Great Expectations, which was, I think, the first one I ever read, I just didn't get his sheer audacity as a writer.
Yeah. And in your book, not only do you defend him to the hilt, you make those points at the beginning in your first very opening introduction, I think, but also talking about the changes of tense. I mean, I think Great Expectations has it fantastically, doesn't it, in that first chapter where he's talking about, my father's family name and ours was the marsh country and all of that, but then suddenly, bang, when it's Magwitch with Hold Your Noise.
Yes.
It's sort of astonishing, isn't it? It sort of uproots everybody, the storyteller and the reader. I think
it's a wonderful sentence, isn't it? It says, ours was the marsh country down by the river, within as the river wound 20 miles of the sea. My first, most vivid and broad impression of the identity of things seems to me to have been gained on a memorable raw afternoon towards evening. And that sentence, it's a brilliant sentence, it seems to me, although apparently quite simple. It starts off with this sort of generality, and then suddenly, and no wonder a filmmaker thinks, yes, I can do this. I can do at least the beginning of this story. This is fantastic. My first, most vivid and broad impression of the identity of things sounds like such a general and vague thing, but it's not. It's this moment, this terrifying, strange encounter, which will form him forever, which he'll never be able to get away from, and which he has to learn to understand the meaning of, actually, because it will lead to everything, to the money, to the whole sort of all the delusions about his gentlemanliness and so on. But it's just wonderful. Oh, it's wonderful.
Yeah, but I actually wondered, what do you think about this, John? But rereading it the other day, just that opening, my father's family name being Pirrip and my Christian name Philip, my infant tongue could make of both names nothing longer or more explicit than Pip. That in itself is almost a bit of a tongue twister, isn't it?
Yes.
Describing...
Well, exactly. I mean, it's a little example of what, again, is a really important and brilliantly used effect in Great Expectations. That when he's talking about himself as a child, he does two things at once. He does that thing we were talking about earlier of taking you absolutely back. There you are. But on the other hand, in the manner of narration, often in the words and syntax he uses, he never lets you forget that he has a later perspective. So, when Estella's laughing at his boots that he wears, he says, I became aware that these were vulgar appendages. And it's really funny, but the comedy relies on the fact that the 8-year-old Pip would not have known the word appendages, would not have called his boots vulgar appendages. And so in a way which is, I think, very true to our own memories, the older Pip, at once, these recollections are utterly vivid and there. On the other hand, there is this sometimes comic distance between himself, the narrator with these long words and elegant sometimes sentences, and the child that he looks back on who was himself.
It's haunting in a way, isn't it? Because there are moments when he really is the child. That line about so sharp was the hurt without a name. He can't find the word for it. And he's as the child in that moment, not being able to find it. And then in others, like you said, appendages would be way out of Pip's 7-year-old vocabulary.
So that's why that thing I was saying at the very beginning, frightening and funny, which is the first chapter, but which is much of the childhood section of Great Expectations. The frightening is what it was like at the time. The funny is what it looks like now. So even in that wonderful fourth chapter about the Christmas meal, which is I tortured my family on Christmas Eve evening by reading them that chapter. And I kept having to stop because I was weeping with laughter, I'm afraid. Actually weeping. But it's so funny because, not despite of, but because at the time for Pip, it's not funny at all. None of it's funny. And the absurd Mr. Hubble and Wopsle and Pumblechook and these people, they're not funny to the child. They are torturers and tormentors, aren't they?
Yes.
But now you're able to see how ridiculous they are.
My favourite is the description of Pumblechook drinking the tar. I don't think I've ever laughed out loud quite. And I was so surprised reading that at 17, finding that funny.
Yeah, it is. And Pumblechook, he's wonderful, isn't he? These absurd people, these sort of small-minded provincial sadists, really, And in this scene, it's from a certain perspective, it's awful. They torture, especially Pumblechook, tortures the child and mocks him. And it starts talking about how it'd be really good to eat him, doesn't he? How you eat a child. They make really terrifying for a small child jokes about cannibalism.
Yes.
Oh, God. Mrs. Joe, said Uncle Pumblechook, a large, hard-breathing, middle-aged, slow man with a mouth like a fish, dull, staring eyes, and sandy hair standing upright on his head, so that he looked as if he'd been all but choked and had that moment come to. I have brought you, as the compliments of the season, I have brought you, Mum, a bottle of sherry wine, and I have brought you, Mum, a bottle of port wine. And
it's great, isn't it?
It's great, but it's as beautifully written as the best paragraph of Henry James. A writer I love, but who is the sort of acme of stylish sophistication. Even the brilliant way Dickens is one of his things he does so cleverly. The way he, it's called suspended quotation, I think. He starts somebody speaking and then he puts them on pause while he tells you something. Mrs. Joe, said Uncle, and there he is, he started, said Uncle Pumblechook, a large, hard-breathing, middle-aged, slow man. And what about the order of those adjectives? And large, hard-breathing, middle-aged, slow man. With a mouth like a fish, dull staring eyes and sandy hair standing upright on his head, so that he looked as if he'd just been all but choked and had that moment come to.
It's perfect, isn't it? It's But there isn't another writer that would have that much of a parenthesis, is there? I could think that would load that much in.
That's a good question. I can't think of one, but I'm now going to go off and see, and perhaps there are, but it's a favourite trick of Dickens, and there is something deliberately cartoonish about it, and people use that's one of those kind of words that people sometimes use of Dickens as a criticism, which I think should be turned on its head, because I think it's brilliantly cartoonish. Pumblechook, there he is. He starts, and then you get all the information, and then he's on again.
Yeah, it's truly wonderful. And it's such a fantastic standalone chapter, isn't it? I can quite imagine you reading that at Christmas. I recommend everyone do that. But I was going to ask about Estella.
Yes.
And you mentioned the ending a little earlier about whether or not it's ambiguous or not.
Yeah, I think the ending, of course, the ending's important. And Great Expectations is the only example where Dickens changed his mind about the ending of a novel. And he really did change his mind, because he wrote an ending which he then scrapped, and which you can now read if you get a decent paperback edition of the novel, or you find it online. It will give you the original ending. And he was persuaded by friends that the ending he originally wrote would upset his readers, and he had to rewrite it. So very briefly, in the ending he originally wrote, Pip comes back after 11 years abroad working with Herbert Pocket. He goes back, he meets Joe and Biddy, who have children, and their oldest is a son that they call Pip. And Pip goes off, little Pip goes off with our hero. And Pip is walking down the street in London with little Pip. And he bumps into Estella, who's in a carriage. And they have a brief conversation. and he's found out that Estella Bentley Drummle has been killed by an angry horse that he's been mistreated, as in the eventual ending. And she's married again, a Shropshire doctor. Can't get more blameless than that. And there's what Dickens originally wrote is brilliant, I think, because she says to Pip something like, they have a scene of mutual forgiveness, and she says something like, hand up that little boy to me. And Pip says, in brackets, thinking, I believe, that the child was mine. And Pip doesn't correct that misunderstanding. And then they part. And so not only does Pip not get Estella, definitely not, because she's married someone else, but she leaves assuming wrongly that he has found a wife and had a child. So it's not just an unhappy ending or sad ending, but also it's a sad ending with a misunderstanding. And Dickens was persuaded to change it, and instead Pip revisits the ruins of Satis House, and there he meets Estella. And it's quite a contrived coincidence, actually, because him meeting there, because he says to her something like, do you often come here? And she says, no, this is the first time I've been back. It just happens to be the day that Pip goes back too. And she says, and again, there's a scene of mutual forgiveness. And then she says, can we be friends? And she says, we will continue as friends apart. And he takes her hand, which is already, in 19th century novel, that's already a very intimate thing to do. I took her hand in mine and we went out of the ruined place. And as the morning mist had risen long ago, when I first left the forge, so the evening mists were rising now. And in all the broad expanse of tranquil light they showed to me, I saw the shadow of no parting from her, which is quite a sort of elaborate way of indicating that maybe they are going to get married. And then in a later edition, he changed it slightly to, I saw no shadow of another parting from her, as if he was fussing about getting it implicit but not explicit. And I think lots of readers feel that even that final ending, which Dickens was persuaded to substitute for his original ending, is still fairly ambiguous. By Dickensian standards of endings, it's very ambiguous, but it's interesting to know that when he first wrote the novel, and we should realize when he wrote, by the time he was writing this in the last sort of half of his career, he always had it really clearly worked out what was going to, he wasn't making up endings as he reached them. He'd worked it all out. He was not a novelist, usually not to know what was going to happen from the very first installment, but he did change his mind this time. And there's a bit of me which wishes that he'd had, the courage of his convictions and stuck with the original ending.
Oh, I see. I'm too soft. I'm one of those people that like the happy ending, potentially.
Well, there you are. You see, that his friends, particularly Bulwer Lytton, were right. That out there were lots of readers like you, Dominic, and you mustn't be disappointed.
Exactly. And I certainly am not. John, this has been the most wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
And I've really enjoyed that, and our listeners will have loved that. So thank you so much. And
well, thanks very much, and thanks. It's very rare to have a conversation with somebody where before you ask each question, I'm thinking, God, Dominic, he knows this stuff really well. I hope he doesn't catch me out.
Oh, I'm so glad I've pulled the wool over your eyes on that. We better end it now.
You definitely have. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
See you.
Thank you for listening to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. I just wanted to quickly say, I want to keep adverts off these episodes. And so if any of you listening would like to make a small donation to cover the costs of creating these episodes, please feel free to look at the link in the description wherever you're listening to this, and you can make a small donation to the Ko-fi website. Thank you again. See you next time.